is an introduction to permaculture slideshow I put together fairly recently, and I thought perhaps it might work by way of introduction to both this Permaculture Academy that we're launching and also to our online permaculture design course. I'm also trying out different forms of ways of technology that we can communicate easily without using loads of bandwidth, and keeping it really accessible to people in all circumstances. I'm aware that increasingly people are watching these kind of things on phones, using mobile data, which may be expensive and stuff like that. So I'm trying to experimenting with all of that. So anyway, welcome to the world of permaculture. I subtitled this talk, "Can we survive climate chaos?" And the answer is I don't know. But we only will if we apply ourselves to it. You know, it's not going to just happen by mistake. It's going to involve us actively, you know, learning and building on a lot of other positive initiatives that are going on. And I think what I like about permaculture is power. It's what it's so useful to is it's a unifying philosophy with 3 ethics at its heart. And 12 guiding principles. So it's easy to remember, it's easy to communicate, and if we sort of follow its patterns, then actually it helps then coordinate global actions and global responses, and in ways in which we're in line with nature and in line with human sort of objectives. That sounds bold, but I think, you know, again, try and bring this alive for you. So this first slide is Mabera Forest. It's part of Forest Reserve, rapidly shrinking, sadly. It's an equatorial forest in Uganda, close to Jinja, between Kampala and Jinja. And it's a reminder that, you know, this is what nature does left to its own devices. It builds huge, complex ecosystems with I think they told us about 200 species of birds unique to this place, 100 species of butterfly. You kind of imagine how, you know, this is what nature does. Nature creates complex dynamic systems that trap carbon and and retain moisture and humidity, and create millions of little niches, of opportunities for biodiversity, for life in its every form, to nest within it, to find its place within it. And permaculture kind of sees this as a model, and that in our sort of regenerative journey, we're going to have to sort of look at nature and nature's patterns and think about how we can apply those in a way in which we're much more deliberately meeting the needs of nature, but also whilst meeting the needs of human society. When we look into nature, what's fascinating is we see the same patterns again and again and again. This cactus photographed in Lanzarote, actually, but conforms, the patterning on it conforms to the world famous Fibonacci series, and which gives us sort of spirals. It gives us a concept, the idea of incremental growth, and it also gives us an idea of an insight into actually that pattern formation is hardwired into the nature of reality. And whether we're looking into galaxies or we're looking down through telescopes or looking down microscopes, we see the same patterns again and again and again. And maybe that's telling us something. Maybe that's something that we can use and learn with. So permaculture is a pattern language based on observations of nature, and actually it finds something that when we do observe nature, we all have a very similar experience, and that's fascinating. These very simple patterns that occur in nature also reoccur. It's repeating patterns. It gives us an idea of the mandala. And what's so interesting is that although the patterns are formed by the same, if you like, forces of physics and biology and whatever, so the same pattern repeats many times. What's also interesting is it's never the same. It's never exactly the same, because the way that the nature works is, as something grows, it's also interacting with the seasons and the cycles, and some of it gets eaten and some of it gets, you know, exposed to the weather or whatever. So there's the expression of nature's patterns is always individual, and that's fascinating too, and that's really a really interesting thing to contemplate. We spend a lot of time thinking about that in permaculture. The next thing that we notice within nature is it's full of dynamic relationships, and those relationships often involve several different species. In fact, when you get sort of technical about it, you realize it involves maybe sometimes hundreds of species. But let's keep this simple, and this is one of my favorite little examples. And this is an acacia thorn tree, and it's a pioneer plant. It's the kind of plant that can grow up in open, in full sun, in tough environments. And it's actually quite nutritious. It's a nitrogen fixing tree, so it builds soil and builds fertility. So it's feeding microbes with its roots, sending sugars to its roots to help build the soil around it. But you notice these strange galls, these swellings on the all over the thorn tree, and they are produced by a termite. And the termite lays its eggs in the bud. It's young and full of sugars. And instead of growing into, I don't know whether the part of the tree it was supposed to grow into, it forms this gall, this sort of sphere of sort of spongy material, which is absolutely ideal for the baby termites that live in. So the tree is prepared to give up some of the sugar that it traps from the sun and then hand it over, if you like, to the termites. But why, I hear you say? Why would the tree give up its hard-earned sugars to feed the termites? And the answer is, well, it's the favorite food of the giraffe. And although it's spiky and thorny, and actually a lot of very nutritious plants tend to be spiky and thorny, and there's a good reason for that, of course, the giraffe loves to eat it. So what happens is that the giraffe has very nimble tongue and lips, and it can delicately sort of pick off the new, fresh young shoots. And what that does is it excites and annoys the termites. They see it as their home, and they rush out and they squirt their formic acid or whatever it is at the giraffe, and that encourages it to move on. So nature's prepared to give up some of its yield. It's prepared to give up some of its sort of sugars to feed other elements in the system. But then there are little feedback mechanisms and dynamic relationships that control that. So the termite stops the giraffe from destroying the bush. But in the process of grazing the bush, the giraffe promotes it as well, the acacia tree, by distributing its seeds and by that really, and by regulating the number of trees. So what's really interesting then is when you start to think about things, nature in terms of its relationships, you realize is where's the boundary between the tree, the termite, and the giraffe? And essentially we could see them as elements and part of the same system. So this is again central to how we think of permaculture. This is based on observation. The next thing, this is just a little indentation on a huge boulder out in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in Uganda or somewhere. And a little bit of rainwater has obviously trapped there repeatedly over time. And that just created the conditions that has allowed nutrients to accumulate, for plants to live and die and grow and photosynthesize. And it looks like a little mini forest starting. And I'm telling you, it's on the top of a huge bare boulder. And this brings us the idea of that actually nature's repeating the same patterns that we see at different scales. So we might be looking at a sort of microscopic version of Mabera forest, if you like, and then it's actually formed using the same processes that Mabera forest might have formed over thousands of years, where this has formed over perhaps just a few years in an indentation in a rock. But you can already see that we've got a complex habitat with different kinds of plants in it, and obviously offering different kinds of niches and opportunities to other species. So this is how nature works. It works in partnership and it works in succession. So actually, we can bring these things together, then we can actually use natural forces to bring back diversity, complexity, and more productive landscapes, especially in sort of damaged, eroded, either over-farmed or urban environments and things which have been degraded by human activity. So in this picture, we see a plant on the left, which is gorse. That's very similar to the acacia in Africa. Here it's a nitrogen-fixing shrub. At the same time, animals like to nibble at the ends of it, but it becomes very dense and spiky, so they never manage to eat all of it. And at the same time, it creates a kind of a nursing bed for other trees and successional plants to form. And interestingly, what we're looking at here is a picture of a community garden. This is in a place called Glencerrig in Wales, near Wrexham in Wales, and it's 1,000 feet above sea level. And the community there have worked together, almost kind of copying the processes of what the gorse has done, but they've harvested the gorse, created fertile soil from it, hold on to that by building raised beds and composting and covering and nurturing the soils, and they've created a very productive, small-scale community sort of garden hub, out of the natural materials that are there. And I think that's the key point for these slides is these are systems that have just been built of the materials that are there already. They haven't been built by things that have been imported long distances from somewhere else. Or if they have, they've naturally flowed through. So here we're looking at, we're in the high Atlas Mountains in North Africa, and we're looking into a huge river bed, which obviously at the times when the meltwater flows, seasonal rains come, it's a huge torrent of a river, which delivers rocks and gravels and things can wash down the mountain. And then slowly what's happened is the communities there, the Berber communities there, have harvested those rocks and gravels, and they've carried them, look, they've rolled them along the contours. They haven't carried them uphill, they've taken them out of the riverbed and they've moved them along contours to build terraces and to build little fields, to build little retaining walls that capture the nutrients and the soil and soil particles that maybe that are migrating down the hill due to gravity and water, and retaining them, and from that building really productive orchards. It's an ongoing process that perhaps has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. It interests me how the settlement is above. So wherever you have houses, you've got hard surfaces, flat roofs, roads. So rainwater floods off very quickly. It's thrown off. And then we've got a whole garden system that's designed to capture that. And think about how that water, rather than torrenting down the hillside, is captured and slowed down by all these terraces built out of the materials that are there available in the stream. And then from that, they've been able to build yields of fruit, feed their community, and give a surplus that they can export for cash. This is exactly how we kind of think in permaculture thinking. Here's a kind of zeroing in on the design of one of those orchards. And again, what you notice is, look, we've got these, here the trees have been carefully planted, carefully positioned, carefully pruned, and the ground around the base of each tree has been sculpted to make an indentation. So that means when it rains, water will be trapped and will infiltrate and feed the tree. And not only that, is that the indentation has been filled with organic matter. Maybe the manure from the goats and the asses that they use, or mules, and another organic material, obviously from the orchard itself. When you have covered soil with a decomposing organic matter on it, which we call mulch, that helps trap rainwater, helps it infiltrate into the soil, and also stops it from evaporating off. So it's a combination of techniques to catch and store energy, to catch and store water, to slow it down, and to build soil by paying attention to detail. So we've taken ideas that we've witnessed around the world and tried to bring those ideas into our own design work, whether it's making this as a community garden designed in Newtown. And you can think about how, especially in gardening spaces, you can integrate together strategically certain elements so that they have spatial relationships. They create microclimates that are beneficial for different plants. Here we've got a lovely stack system, a trellised spallied fruit trees. These look like apples to me. And underneath we've got layers of berries and herbs and herbaceous plants. So, and then that's creating a wind-sheltered area, perhaps where we can grow other annual plants in a protected way. So again, so permaculture, we're interested in integrating things together and creating a range of different habitats so that we can have diversity. Now this next slide is North Wales. This is close to where I live, and over a millennia, I suppose, I don't know, maybe longer, we've turned what was a complex forested landscape like Madeira forest, the temperate equivalent, into just a very simple monoculture of just sheep, and more sheep, or more importantly, actually grass. And sheep are voracious grazers, so they'll remove any other crops any other plants that want to know, herbs and interesting young trees maybe that want to get established in this landscape. They'll get eaten by the sheep first, and they kind of eat the grasses last, to be honest. So it means there's nothing left. There's no diversity there, and we become very used to seeing, very accustomed to looking at these landscapes and just thinking, oh, it's beautiful, it's nature, it's North Wales, that's what it looks like. Well, here's an example from Timor, from East Timor, from the work of the Timor-Leste Permaculture Foundation. And they've deliberately, they're on their mountainside, and what they've done is they've created a whole range of different strategies to, again, a bit like what we've seen in the Morocco example, to catch and store raised beds, slow the passage of water, create edges, create complexity, create differences between wet and dry areas, intensive animal areas, intensive tree areas, annual crops. Look, we've got nice raised beds, intensive areas there, like we saw in the Wales example. We've got really nice keyhole beds down the bottom. So think about how water, nutrients, manure, surplus from the upper systems can easily gravitate downhill, but each time be trapped and used into another system. Help feed some chickens here. Manure from the chickens can help feed these intensive gardens. And these intensive gardens then might be able to build a relationship to the community of the people around it. So think about how in permaculture we're trying to build much more complex, much more much more interactive systems where there's as many different connections and interconnections that we can possibly create. This is us moving into a Welsh project, moving again into a sheep monoculture in one of those places where there's really just nothing but grass. And by negotiating with our community, we got permission to plant an orchard in the middle of the field, and we had to leave most of it still blank so that other things could happen there. But also we planted down this edge here a windbreak with a really fast-growing variety of tree that grows in temperate climates called willow. There's many tropical equivalents, and every year we started up just by literally sticking the sticks in the ground through a membrane to give them a chance to outcompete the grasses. And then every year we can harvest it, and it produces tons of biomass. But the trees are still in place, the roots are still there, providing nutrients to soil microbes, etc., and supporting wildlife and nature. And the orchard itself we've tried to make that as diverse as we can by adding in as many different varieties of apple tree and pear tree and things that we could get a hand on. Traditional old varieties. We also sowed things like yellow rattle, which is a parasitic plant, into the grass, which weakens the grasses and allows other plants to get established, not least our young trees. And this is the willow coppice again, and you can see through the seasons the garden has slowly established itself. We've added layers of complexity to the garden. This was a little herb garden. This is some permaculture students working with us on that. And just in a few short years, I mean, in temperate climate, things happen a bit more slowly than in the tropics. But the whole landscape starts to change. We get a whole variety of different plants, different little niches and habitats, different organisms to move in, insects and birds, and also slowly, building a more fertile soil. Now, as much as we talk about diversity in the plants and in the environment, we've also tried to create ways in which we can interact with every aspect, diversity of our own community. So here's us working with a MenCat group, people with learning differences. This is the site which our local community has offered us to set up another little sort of horticulture training hub. We're always kind of looking for those little unused edges or pockets of population and ways that we could perhaps interact with them and bring them into being part of our integrated permaculture system. One people, one planet. Just referencing here's one. It's really this really important idea to realise that for all our idea of separateness and nationhood and all of that is, we really are one species, Homo sapiens, sharing one ecosystem called planet Earth. and it ain't as big as we think it is. If you take all the water on the earth and turn it into like a snowball or something, you realize it's a tiny amount of it's just a film of water just covering the globe, a film of air. We're all in the same fishbowl. We're all breathing the same air and drinking the same water and exchanging the same nutrients and chemicals and what have you. And we need to be much more aware of that in the way that we approach our planning and thinking and the way that we relate to each other. And this is becoming more and more central now, in educational work, to help connect kids to each other, connect different age groups to each other, and to reconnect children to landscape and to food. Very much in the UK over the years, the sort of supermarketization, as I like to call it, of food, the commoditization of food is increasingly, we have kids growing up who've only eaten hyper-processed food. They've never really eaten raw ingredients. They've had biscuits and pizzas and pies, but they've never really had, just prepared potatoes or vegetables or something. And that's not good for many reasons. But again, lack of diversity. So here's a lovely slide. This is a community project where we work together for 3 years, that referenced to earlier, Horticulture Training Centre in Newtown in Paris. And then from that has actually evolved its own, it's called Cultivate, its own kind of community organisation that carries on that work. And again, one of the sort of really important ideas of permaculture is self-replicating systems. Or can we set something in motion that then carries on without us having to keep putting in constant inputs, or if you like, it passes on to the next generation of people, or has in some way has a life of its own. The metaphor of having a child, and first it's very helpless, you have to do everything for it, and as it grows and develops, it becomes increasingly independent and starts to make its own decisions based on its own experience. Can we do that with projects? Can we do that with businesses? Can we do that with community initiatives? Can we set things up, gardens and ecosystems as well, that actually then have a life of their own, so that we don't have to spend the whole time just maintaining things, but we can actually just then go on to the next thing. So, and that's the journey. This is my home. It's a little cooperative. So this is also about really how people live as ecosystems. It's about how we are interdependent and need to work together. And the more we can achieve that,